Good afternoon once again, everyone. Thank you all for attending this webinar. And it's scheduled to run for 1 hour. So we will share the substantive content that we had in mind till about 3:45, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions. So feel free to share your questions in the chat window that you'll see provided. And we will jump straight in. Right, so this webinar, we wanted to talk about a few key changes to the compliance requirements of companies that have happened over the last 6 months. So the common theme amongst these changes seems to be that the MCA would like to have greater oversight over various affairs of companies which are registered under the Act. And what this means for companies is an increased compliance burden, and it requires everyone to be on their toes in order to ensure compliance and to make sure that companies are not opened up to a range of liabilities due to non-compliance with these changes. So what really are the changes that we're going to be talking about? So the scope of this webinar is about four to five themes which we will talk about. So these relate to changes to the deposit amendment rules, certain compliances required for companies that have suppliers who are micro and small enterprises, certain changes to the incorporation rules, changes to the prospectus and allotment of securities rules, and one of the biggies that has had corporate India sort of up in arms, which relates to the concept of significant beneficial ownership. So we'll go through some of these in greater detail. So let's start with changes to the deposit rules, right? So these sort of came out early on in the year, in January, when the MCA issued a notification where Form DPT3, which is the form where earlier companies were required to disclose details of deposits that they had taken in compliance with the Act. The change that was brought about was to say that not just do companies need to disclose details of deposits that they have taken, but they also need to disclose transactions that they have treated as not being deposits. So it's a sort of negative kind of compliance in that sense. And the period for which this reporting was supposed to be made is the period from April 1st, 2014 to March 31st, 2019, which is the initial period. And this is followed by an annual compliance also, which is required. So some of the sort of reactions that these amendments called, that were made in reaction to these amendments was also the comment that it's not entirely clear why the MCA wants to know about details of transactions that are not considered to be deposits. So probably one thing that throws light on this is the actual initial reporting period. Since it starts on the 1st of April 2014, that also happens to be the date when the new Companies Act also came into effect. That could be one reason where the government also wants to see what has been the nature of compliance with the revised deposit framework itself. So, of course, that is just one hazarding a guess. And the deadline for compliance with this form is something that is looming large over the next couple of days. So companies are required to make sure that they are in compliance with these rules by filing Form DPT3. So the practical implications of having to file this form is that basically all companies which have received any kind of monies which are included in the list of exceptions to the definition of a deposit. And this is a fairly large list which is available in the rules. in excess of about 15 to 16 items, and they include a range of amounts, such as money that you may have received from the government, any money that you may have received from a person resident outside of India in compliance with the FEMA, amounts that you may have received as advances from various persons who owe you payment, intercorporate loans, loans from directors. So there's a fairly long list, and these would have to be disclosed, and this would require companies to go back and analyze within the reporting period these various amounts that would have to be disclosed. And this is a sort of factual analysis which needs to be taken up, and in our experience we've seen that there are a lot of practical queries which also arise in the course of determining what amounts would actually be treated as an exempted deposit that would have to be disclosed. Surabhi, is there anything you wanted to add on this topic?
So,
I'm just requesting my colleague and co-panelist Surabhi to also chip in with any additional points as far as deposits are concerned.
so if one looks at the exemptions to the deposit rules, it's fairly clear that day-to-day business transactions could also be covered under the exceptions. So it's not just one-time received monies that companies need to take note of, but every day there's actually an exception which covers regular business transactions, such as advances that you may receive for any supplies or orders that you've placed. So these things will also have to be taken note of, and if companies don't have a bookkeeping method to actually note all advances, you should actually over the course of the year see what all advances that you have received, and if anything is outstanding at the end of the financial year, that's what will have to be disclosed in DPT3.
Thanks, Surabhi. Okay, so let's move on. The next topic that we wanted to talk about, we've also got some information about the various penalties, etc., which we won't go into here, since that is available in the Act as well. So the next topic we wanted to talk about was, again, certain changes that came about in quite early on in the year, in January itself. This was a certain order which required specified companies, and who are these companies? Basically, they're all companies who have vendors who are micro and small enterprises, right? So immediately the thought that may arise to your mind is, how do you determine whether a vendor is a micro or a small enterprise? So there are certain registrations that these MSCs would need to have in order to for them to be able to avail of this status as a micro or a small enterprise, who would be entitled to the benefit of this both of this order and of the MSME Act itself, right? So the first practical a thing that companies would need to do is actually to get a declaration from their vendors to check whether any of these are micro or small enterprises. And why does this become relevant? This becomes relevant because of the statutory benefits that these micro or small enterprises are entitled to. So if you see in the current slide that we have, the MSME Act defines what an enterprise is. It also defines what a micro enterprise is, what a small enterprise is, and what a medium enterprise is. So the interesting point about this order is that medium enterprises are actually not covered under the ambit of the protection provided under this order. It is only micro and small enterprises, right? So the definition of what micro and small enterprises are also there, in addition to the actual registration that they also need to have. And how do you check if you are a company to whom this order applies? So that's the definition of a specified company, which is now there on the screen. So basically, if you have availed of goods or services from micro or small enterprises, and if your payments to these suppliers exceed 45 days, right? So then that will be subject to the MSME Act. And what the Act basically says is that there is a certain interest rate that then becomes applicable on these delayed payments, and companies are required to make payments to their suppliers along with this sort of penal interest which applies, which is linked to the to the reference rate published by the Reserve Bank. And what this order now seeks to do is it requires all companies who have outstanding payments to micro and small enterprises to make a disclosure by filing a form of the amounts which are pending for late payment, and also the reasons for the late payment. So this seems to be in keeping with the thrust of the reason for the protections afforded to MSMEs, which is basically to give a boost to these really small sort of players in the ecosystem, whether they are manufacturers, whether they are service providers. And given the practical reality in India today, where the payment cycles of for suppliers can get painfully long, which in itself has led to the mushrooming of a whole range of new entrepreneurs in the supply chain financing space. The government is trying to get data on the chronicity of this problem of delayed payments, and given the fact that there are penal interest provisions also applicable, it is in companies' interests, if you have MSE suppliers, make sure that you're in compliance with this order, right? So the very first sort of order of business should be that you get a declaration from your vendors that are they MSEs. If they are, you should keep track of payments being made to them, and including whether any interest has already started kicking off. So yeah, that's as far as this goes. Next, we'll be jumping to certain changes that have been made to the incorporation rules. So I'm requesting Surabhi, my co-panelist, to take over for this part.
So the incorporation rules were amended earlier this year. The notification was dated in February. So the purpose of these amendments was for the MCA to have greater visibility of companies which were functioning, and to ensure that any shell companies which were there could be struck off from the register. What the amendment does is that you need to file a form active, which is INC 22A. The form requires you to give details of your registered office and your key managerial personnel. There are certain consequences that entail if you don't file this form INC 22A, which are quite severe. And the INC 22A applies to companies which have been incorporated before 31st December 2017. And the form active was supposed to be done before 15th of June 2019. You can still file your form active if you haven't done it yet, but this requires you to pay an additional fee of 10,000 rupees. There's an exemption from non-filing of form active. This is only for companies who have been struck off or in the process of being struck off or are under liquidation. So if the current slide actually details the consequences that entail if you haven't filed your form active. One of the most important consequences is you can't file form SF7 or form PAS3 both of which Form SF7 is required for any changes to your authorized share capital. So you can't reclassify or increase your authorized share capital. And PAS 3 is your return of allotment, which is required to be done on an allotment of any shares of the company, of any securities of the company. So for companies wishing to receive investment, if you can't file your Form PAS 3, your securities cannot be validly allotted. Apart from this, every director of a non-active company is also, so if an active company, if your company has not filed a Form Active, the directors of such companies on the MCA portal, it will be said that these are directors of non-active companies. While there is no direct consequence for such directors, until the form has, until the company has filed Form Active, the directors will be continued to, the MCA portal reflects to say that the directors are directors of non-active companies. So details of company, photo of the registered office and the KMP, and details of KMP are the details that are required in INC 22A. I'm handing the presentation back to Neela. She'll guide you through the SPO rules.
Thanks, Surabhi. I think that was an interesting exposition of this Form E-Active, which has been causing some companies a lot of grief. And in fact, some of the there were certain articles also written by prominent company secretaries, which also raised practical issues like uploading of these photographs involves file size could be huge. What if there are multiple companies with the same registered office? You'll have multiple photographs of the same place, and what really is the sort of impact that this requirement, and it seems almost a kind of absurd requirement in that sense, but this obviously has caused strong reactions from a variety of stakeholders and constituents. So but the fact remains that if you haven't filed these forms, as Surabhi was mentioning, your other corporate activity gets stuck. So it's in everybody's interest to make sure that this is complied with fairly quickly. Right. So shifting gears, we'll move to the next topic, which is the topic of significant beneficial ownership. Okay. So there has been a global trend to attack the phenomenon of shell companies, right? So globally, regulators across the world are wanting to know who the ultimate owners of various corporate entities are, to ensure that various concerns around money laundering, terrorist financing, and other criminal activity can also be, you can shine a sharper light on some of those issues as well. And on the heels of this global trend is what India has also been doing in the area of beneficial ownership. The latest rules came out in February of this year. If you'll recall, some time, a few months ago, which was when the first set of the SPO rules were released, there was a real hue and cry, because I think it was what the rules did was sort of in the nature of this really phenomenon of trying to catch certain kinds of fish, but then because you're following an almost dredging kind of mechanism, you end up catching a lot of unwanted things also in your net. And similarly, there were a lot of situations that did not really need to be caught under the radar of what these rules actually were trying to do. So because there was a lot of feedback and hue and cry from industry, the government has come out with a revised set of rules, which have made these rules much more streamlined in their applicability and have provided a lot of clarity on what kind of shareholding, what kind of beneficial owners would be covered and would be required to make disclosure under these rules. And what has come also as a relief to many entities who were concerned about having to disclose a lot of sensitive personal information. So the new rules have also done away with the requirement to actually enclose identity proof and so on and so forth, because there were a lot of concerns also around the privacy of the data of the individual beneficial owners, which would have had to be disclosed under the old regime. So let's look at we'll also go through what the forms are that have to be filed. But let's first try to understand how these rules actually apply. Okay. So, so the first concept that we need to understand is who is a significant beneficial owner, right? So, what we're looking at here is we're looking at trying to identify an individual, right? So, an individual would be considered to be a significant beneficial owner of shares in a company if that individual holds indirectly or with direct holdings more than 10% of the shares of the company, or more than 10% of the voting rights, or more than 10% of the right to receive distributions or dividends from that company, or if that individual exercises significant influence or control, right? So that person would be deemed to be a significant beneficial owner and is required to make disclosures. So what you would need to then check if your, it could be a company, for most of the attendees on this call, I think that most of you all either are in-house counsels and companies, or funds, or your company secretaries, or you're basically advising some kind of body corporate, whether in India or abroad. So what you need to check is you need to check whether your company or your fund or your partnership firm or trust, have you made investments in companies where you hold more than 10% of the various items that I described? If yes, if the answer to that question is no, then there is nothing further that you need to do. If the answer to that question is yes, then you need to check as to what is the constitution of the member that we're talking about, right? So we're talking about the shareholder in the reporting company. What is the terminology that they use, Survi? So the company is the reporting company, right? And then the shareholder is the member company, right? So if the member company in the reporting company, so you need to look at whether the member company holds more than 10%. And if the member company holds more than 10% in the reporting company, then you need to do the next analysis, okay, which is there on the next few slides. So if you have determined that you are a company and you own more than 10% in the reporting company, then you need to shine the light on yourself. You need to check that is there an individual shareholder who holds the majority stake, that is more than 50%, or either in the shareholder company itself or in the ultimate holding company. And you have to proceed to do that check until you're able to actually identify a particular individual, if there is. Okay? If there isn't an individual who holds a majority stake either in the member or in the ultimate holding company, there's nothing further that needs to be done. That's the analysis as far as a body corporate is concerned. There could also be pooled investment vehicle, and this would be the implications of these rules to pooled investment vehicles. I'm sure would be of interest to a number of you. So the first question to check is: are you a pooled investment vehicle which is also registered with the Securities Exchange Board of India? So if you are an AIF or any other kind of investment vehicle which is registered with the SEBI, then you are specifically exempt under these rules and you are not required to make any disclosures. Okay? But if you are a pooled investment vehicle which is not registered with the SEBI, then the analysis is slightly different. You would require to disclose as a significant beneficial owner, either your general partner or your investment manager. And if your investment manager is a company, then the CEO of that company has to be disclosed. The next slides have the same analysis if the member is a trust or if the member is a partnership. So that analysis would have to be taken care of. And as I was mentioning earlier, there are certain specified entities which are specifically exempt from the applicability of these rules, including SEBI registered investment vehicles. I just quickly also want to take you through the forms that are required to be filed. So there are a number of compliances to be kept in mind here. The BEN1 form is the disclosure of beneficial ownership, which the significant beneficial owner is required to make to the company. Once the company receives these forms, it then makes a consolidated reporting which has to be filed by it in form BEN2. And there is also a certain register of significant beneficial owners which needs to be maintained by the company. So there are multiple sort of pieces of paper that have to be maintained by different stakeholders under this particular framework. So that's something that has to be kept in mind. Note also that under the relevant sections, the reporting company has the power to actually write to its shareholders if it believes that there may be a beneficial ownership of the nature that these rules set out, requiring those shareholders to come forward and make these disclosures. And the section also provides for the ability of the company to even approach the NCLT if it believes that these disclosures are not forthcoming. So that can lead to the NCLT, if it so determines after analysis of the case, it can also result in restrictions on the shares being placed by the NCLT. So this is something that all shareholders need to be cautious about and aware of. There are also fairly hefty penalties that could be implicated. So best not to fall foul of these rules. So, anything you want to add on SPO? Yeah, go ahead.
Just a couple of points to what Neela mentioned. One is the SPO rules are not applicable to holding companies. So if a company has a holding company, is a wholly owned subsidiary of a holding company, then the SPO rules will not be applicable to such shareholding by the holding company. The other thing is the power of the NCLT that the NCLT has when the reporting company makes an application to the NCLT if the member company or the individual has not been forthcoming in the information required. This might pan out to greater consequences if there is a shareholder dispute, because a reporting company can approach the NCLT and say that, if there's a shareholder dispute between the company and the shareholder, the reporting company can approach the NCLT saying that the member company has not furnished correct information to me, and the NCLT has powers to encumber the shares that the member company has. I mean, this is a very far-fetched scenario, but it's still a technical reading of the law. This can happen. That's it on SPO. Neela, anything else?
No, I think on SPOs that's about it.
Yeah.
You want to move ahead to the next?
Yeah. So the next set of rules that have come in 2019, this is the last one that we'll be tackling today, is amendments to the prospectus and allotment of securities rules. So this particular amendment is relevant only in the context of unlisted public companies. So in 2018, the Companies Act was amended for unlisted public companies through an amendment to the prospectus rules to say that unlisted public companies will only issue shares in demat form, or whatever shares that unlisted public companies have, they have to be converted to demat form. So the amendment to the prospectus rules in 2019 follows on the 2018 amendment. What the 2019 amendment has done is that they've introduced Form PAS 6, which is to be filed by unlisted public companies. And the rules are effective from September 30th of 2019. What the particulars that Form PAS 6 requires are details of the share capital of the company. So essentially, all of the details that are required in PAS 6 tries to tabulate if there's a difference between the total share capital of the company and the share capital that's been issued in demat form. Because of the introduction of the rule last year, all of the shares of the company needs to be in demat form. And if there's any discrepancy between the total and the shares in demat form, the form also asks you to state the reasons why there's such discrepancy. And a chartered accountant or a company secretary is to certify and file this form. Neela, do you have anything else?
I think as far as this was concerned, that was everything that we wanted to say. Right, so this sums up, I think, the substantive portion of what we wanted to cover in this presentation. We'd be happy to take any questions that you may have, and feel free to use the, there should be a Q&A chat window that you can use to ask your questions. Thank you for a patient hearing, and we hope that you found this interesting. Our contact details are also available, so if you have any specific questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Okay, I see a hand raised. Just give us a moment while we collate the questions, and then we'll take the questions. We'll read out the question and then provide the answers that it benefits all of you. Just give us a moment, please. Right, so one question which has been raised is, if there is no amount due to an MSME vendor, is there a need to file a nil declaration? I don't think there is any such requirement. because the government is keen to know about amounts outstanding. So we don't believe that there is a requirement to file a nil declaration. Okay. So there's another question on the SBO rules, which is, to the entity holding more than 10%, should it be an Indian entity or could it also be a foreign entity? So yes, definitely, it can be an entity from any jurisdiction. There is no there is no suggestion that it is restricted to Indian entities. So yes, it can also be foreign entities, definitely. Yeah, Rohini, I think you had a question. Do you want to ask it? I think Rohini, you can. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. I just want to know if pooled investment vehicles also include special purpose vehicles?
So it depends uh, if the SPV is pooling funds from multiple investors, then there's a chance that it may be covered. We'd have to get into specifics to understand the structure a little better to see if that's something that would apply.
Right. All right.
Thank you.
I just want to understand a bit on that NCLT's jurisdiction that your colleague was just mentioning
Sure.
about the powers of the NCLT to encumber the shares of the disclosing company. So, could she please repeat on that?
Yeah, sure. In fact, what we'll do is we'll just read out the actual text of the section, so that makes it very clear.
So the NCLT has the power where a company makes an application to the NCLT and it determines that the information given is not satisfactory. For an order directing that the shares in question be subject to restrictions, including restrictions on the transfer of interest attached to the shares in question, suspension of the right to receive dividend or any other distribution in relation to the shares, suspension of the voting rights, or any other restriction on any or all of the rights attached with the shares in question. So these are the powers that the NCLT has.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wait.
So thank you all for participating and asking questions. We still have a couple of minutes. So if you have further questions, feel free to share or to contact us separately. If you are not already on our mailing list, please do drop us a line so we can add you to our mailing list so that you can get our regular updates. I think we just sent an update around yesterday on the deposit rules. So I think if there aren't any further questions, then we will call it a day for today. Feel free to reach out to us separately. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Surabhi.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.